Well, last week YouTube recorded more than 8 million simultaneous live streams as Felix Baumgartner jumped from more than 24 miles above the earth, traveling more than 830 miles per hour. But before taking the record-breaking plunge, he said, "I wish the whole world could see what I see." Sometimes you have to go really high to understand how small you really are. In this morning's text, Job was given the same opportunity as Felix Baumgartner. In a conversation with God, the source of all that is, Job got a chance to understand just how small he really was. If you'll remember from last week, Job was thoroughly upset with God because the only thanks Job seemed to get for having been a good and righteous man all his life was nothing but loss of everything that was dear to him: his wealth, his children, and his health. Job was demanding an answer from the Almighty, a reason for all these horrible things that had happened to him. And for the first 37 chapters of this book, Job complains and his friends pontificate about his circumstances, while God remains virtually silent. But in this morning's reading, God finally responds out of a whirlwind. And the response takes everyone off guard. If you witnessed the vice presidential or either of the presidential debates, you may feel that God's in-your-face and at times sarcastic responses to Job sound a bit like the emotional rhetoric that took place between the political candidates. In truth, God doesn't address any of Job's complaints. Another similarity to the debates. Nowhere within the long poetic discourse does God explain why Job, the upright, righteous servant, has suddenly ended up as Job, the innocent victim. Job receives no answers from God, but only questions. Questions like, who are you? Where were you? What do you know? And can you? On one hand, it seems that God's intent is to overwhelm Job with God's confrontational, biting, and intimidating words. And Job appears to be no match for God as God punches away at the mere mortal. We wonder if maybe God's goal is to force Job into a retraction of his case. But on the other hand, maybe God is simply doing Job a favor. You see, like many of us, Job has gotten stuck in his ideas about God. His image is that of a celestial judge who sits on a throne, detached from all the suffering that is taking place in the world and passing judgment without so much as a thought of the effect it has on people like Job. And Job has lost all sense of his own place relative to the rest of creation. Maybe God is doing Job the favor of revealing God's self to Job, thereby leading Job to a renewed and enlarged vision of who God is and what it means to be human. Although we only get a sneak peek at God's words to Job in this morning's reading, the actual monologue is 4 chapters long, but well worth the read if you get a chance. Let me share with you a few things that our lectionary reading skips over. For one thing, for those people who are locked into a male image of God, the text has God balancing that image with female imagery. God describes the sea as bursting forth from God's womb. God gives birth to all of nature, including the ice and frost. God makes baby clothes for God's creation, the darkness and the clouds. And like an anxious mother who sets boundaries for her children, insisting that they not go out into the streets to play, God is described as prescribing bounds for God's own children of nature. God paints a picture of a world that is wild and beautiful and free, untamed by humans, yet easily controlled and cared for by the compassionate one who created them. God provides food for the lion and the raven, acts as a midwife to the deer and mountain goats, and empowers the hawk and eagle to soar through the air. God even hooks Leviathan, the mighty sea monster, as if it were nothing more than a catfish, taming and silencing it into submission. But in this long catalog of terrestrial and celestial creatures and creations, there is one glaring omission. Human beings have almost no place in this 4-chapter long speech. The world is not centered on human beings according to the divine speeches. It's a wild and untamed world, not an entirely safe or predictable one, but it's beautiful and good nonetheless. And it's one into which God invites Job to take his rightful place, but not at its center, the position at which Job, as well as many of us, imagine ourselves to be. All too often, my world is one in which I am at its center. The only things that are important are my deadlines, my partner, my family, my finances, and my health. Job was the center of his universe, sitting in judgment at the city gates, surrounded by his family and possessions, and admired by everyone. But like many of us, Job thought that life is supposed to be fair. The righteous are always rewarded, and the wicked are always punished. And Job was the most righteous person of all, as even God acknowledged in the beginning of this tale. But as he was given image after image of the greatness of God's cosmos, Job's perspective changed. He no longer sees himself or his troubles as the most important in the universe. As he was given a God's eye view of the universe, he could only squeak out the response, "I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth." Words of humility that sound amazingly similar to those of Felix Baumgartner. But just as the image of us as the center of the universe is egotistical and inaccurate, so too the image of us as completely insignificant in the grand scheme of things is warped and incorrect. It doesn't honor God to imagine ourselves to be unworthy and unimportant in God's world. God doesn't make trash, never has, and never will. For all God's silence concerning human beings in this text, God gives humanity, in the person of Job, a special place in creation. You see, Job is the only one who gets a grand tour of the cosmos, and through it, God invites him and us to see the world from God's perspective and to delight in its beauty and freedom as much as God does. So is this an adequate response to Job's suffering? Many of us would say it isn't. It's not a comfort to someone who has lost his children, all his possessions, and his health. Not exactly the most pastoral response I would have come up with. But the speeches of God at the end of the book of Job accomplish something very important. They move Job out of his endless cycle of grief into life again. And isn't that what was really needed? As Job saw it, He needed answers to his why questions. Why did these things happen? Why is there suffering? Why do the wicked go unpunished? But what Job really needed was a jump start, a way to return to the land of the living. He needed to find a reason to move from his own troubles back into the world again. And God provided that reason by showing him the magnificence of it all. Sometimes there just isn't an answer for why things happen the way they do. They simply happen. And when they do, we have a tendency to be stunned into paralysis. Our world stops turning, and all we are able to do is ask, why? But if we are lucky enough, and still enough, and open to the experience, God reveals God's self to us. And we discover that God is not a distant, detached, judgmental deity that carelessly allows suffering as we once had imagined. But instead, God is revealed in all creation as compassionate and intimately involved with each of us. And we realize that we are part of God's creation, part and parcel of the great web of the universe, an important part that is connected to the many other important parts of our world. And we realize that God is God and we are not. And that's the way it's supposed to be. When life becomes so oppressive and all we can do is obsess on the darkness of our own circumstances, may we each open ourselves to an encounter with the divine. May we each catch our breath at the vastness of God's universe. And after we rise up from our knees, may we give thanks to God for the opportunity to share this world with the rest of creation. Amen.